Commander Victoria Hayes walked through the long corridors of the Sentinel, the Earth's primary orbital research station. Her boots clicked softly against the metallic floor as she made her way toward the observation deck. The station hung above Earth like a watchful guardian, and today Victoria needed to see what threatened their world. She reached the viewport and placed her hand on the cool glass. There in the vast darkness of space she could see them. The Vareth fleet had arrived. The ships were enormous, far larger than anything humanity had ever built. They resembled something between a geometric shape and a living organism, with surfaces that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. Victoria had studied the reports for weeks. The Vareth were an ancient civilization that ruled over 3,000 worlds across multiple star systems. They had existed for thousands of years while humans were still figuring out how to survive on a single planet. To them, Earth was nothing. To them, humanity was nothing. The communication channel buzzed to life. It was Dr. Chen from the Science Division. His voice sounded nervous. He told Victoria that the Varath diplomatic envoy was ready to make contact. They wanted to meet with the leaders of Earth in exactly 2 hours. Victoria's jaw tightened. She had known this moment was coming, but knowing and experiencing were different things. The United Nations had been preparing for first contact for months, but no amount of preparation seemed adequate now that the aliens actually hung above them in the sky. She took a transport ship down to Geneva, where the United Nations headquarters was located. The building seemed smaller than usual, as if the entire structure had shrunk under the weight of what was about to happen. World leaders filled the conference room, their faces showing varying degrees of fear, confusion, and desperation. The Varath representatives appeared on the largest screen in the room. They looked nothing like humans. Their bodies were tall and angular, with skin that appeared to be metallic gray. Their eyes were large and black without any visible pupils. When they spoke, their voices came through perfectly translated into human languages. Yet something in the tone seemed cold and distant. The lead Varath, who identified herself as Council Speaker Zelax, delivered their message with absolute clarity. Humanity, she explained, had been observed and evaluated. The Varath had examined human physiology, human military capabilities, and human psychological resilience. The conclusion was final. Humans were a developing species, interesting in some ways, but ultimately not ready for the galactic community. However, the Varath were not cruel. They offered humanity a choice. The first option was voluntary integration into their labor force. Humans would be transported to various Vareth worlds to work in the industries and tasks that Vareth citizens found tedious. The humans would be treated fairly, given adequate food and shelter, and allowed to maintain basic family units. The second option was resistance. If humanity attempted to fight against integration, the Vareth would have no choice but to perform an extinction-level response. The Vareth had the technology to sterilize entire planets. Earth would become a barren world, stripped of all life. Victoria watched as the world leaders reacted with panic. Some shouted, others wept. A few called for immediate surrender. The French representative stood up and suggested they accept the Vareth offer. Better to survive as a workforce than to be completely erased from existence. Victoria said nothing. She watched. She observed. She listened to the fear in every voice in that room. These were the smartest people on Earth, the leaders of nations, and none of them saw what she saw. The Vareth operated on the principle of logic. They evaluated situations based on data and made decisions based on calculated outcomes. To them, humans were inferior, because every measurement they had taken showed this to be true. But the Varath had made a critical error. They had only measured what they knew how to measure. Victoria requested to speak. The room fell silent as heads turned toward her. She was just one person, just one commander, standing against the consensus of the world's leaders. But she spoke anyway. She told the assembled leaders that the Vareth had studied humans as if humans were simple machines. But humans were not machines. Humans had something that could not be measured in conventional ways. Humans had creativity, adaptability, and an almost infinite capacity to find solutions to problems that seemed impossible. Then Victoria made her proposal. She told the world leaders that she would face the Vareth directly. She would volunteer as humanity's representative in a formal challenge to the Alien Council. If she could demonstrate that humans possessed capabilities the Vareth had failed to account for, then the aliens would be forced to grant Earth-protected status. The Varath had their own codes of honor and logic. If those codes said that an opponent had earned the right to exist, then the Varath would honor that decision. The room erupted. Voices spoke over each other, some praising her bravery, others calling her insane. How could one human possibly stand against aliens who had superior technology and centuries of combat experience? But Victoria was not moved by doubt. She had spent her entire military career learning how to think beyond the obvious solutions. She understood that sometimes the best way to win was not to fight like your enemy expected you to fight. She contacted Council Speaker Zelax directly and made her proposal. The Varath found it amusing. A single human female thought she could challenge the might of their civilization? Very well. The Varath agreed to the challenge. If this human could somehow prove that her species possessed unexpected capabilities, the Varath would grant Earth protected status for 1 year, during which they would withdraw from the region. The chances of Victoria succeeding seemed impossible. Even Victoria understood this. But impossibility had never stopped humans before. She left Geneva that same day and traveled to a classified military facility hidden deep within the Nevada desert. There she would begin her preparation. There she would learn not to fight like a human or an alien, but to fight like something that existed between both worlds. The Varath had declared humanity outmatched. They had made their assessment and found humans lacking. But Victoria knew something that the Varath did not. She knew that being outmatched did not mean being beaten. Sometimes being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. As she boarded the transport ship that would take her into the desert, Victoria looked back at Earth one final time. The blue planet hung in the darkness, and above it the Varath fleet waited. They were confident. They were certain of their victory. They had no idea what they were about to face. The facility was called Research Station 7, though the official name did not matter much since hardly anyone in the world knew it existed. It sat buried in the desert, hidden beneath layers of rock and sand. The walls were thick enough to withstand any conventional explosion. The technology inside was some of the most advanced that humanity possessed. Victoria arrived on a cold morning in October. The sky above the desert was the color of old copper, and the heat pressed down like a weight. She stepped out of the military transport and saw Colonel Nathan Hughes waiting for her. He was a tall man with gray at the temples and eyes that had seen too many conflicts. He had spent 30 years studying unconventional warfare and psychological operations. Hughes guided her through the facility. They passed through security checkpoints and descended deeper into the earth. The air became cooler as they went down, and the lights overhead hummed with a steady electrical current. Eventually, they reached the central research area. There, Victoria met Dr. Marcus Webb, a neuroscientist who had dedicated his career to understanding how the human brain works under extreme stress. Webb was younger than Hughes, perhaps 40, with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to look directly into a person's thoughts. He explained that his team had been studying human cognition for the past 6 months, preparing for Victoria's arrival. They showed her the training chambers. One was designed to simulate high-stress combat situations. Another contained technology that could measure her brain activity, heart rate, and other physiological responses. A third room held detailed holograms of Varath warriors in combat positions. Dr. Priya Kapoor was the facility's biomechanical engineer. She was a small woman with Indian features and brilliant mind that seemed to work at a speed faster than normal conversation. She explained that she had been designing adaptive combat techniques, specifically tailored to humans. These techniques would not focus on strength or speed, where humans would always lose to the Varath. Instead, they would focus on flexibility, balance, and the human capacity to generate power from unexpected angles. Lieutenant James Cooper was the final member of Victoria's core team. He specialized in tactical deception and misdirection. Cooper had a quiet way of speaking that made people listen carefully to every word. He had studied hundreds of military encounters and understood how to make an enemy think one thing while you were actually doing something completely different. Victoria's training began at 5 in the morning and did not end until long after the sun had set. Every day followed a similar pattern. She would start with meditation and tactical breathing exercises that Dr. Webb had developed. These techniques taught her how to maintain control of her mind and body, even when facing overwhelming stress. Then she would move to the combat chamber. Priya would guide her through movements that seemed strange at first. They were not the traditional combat techniques Victoria had learned in her military training. Instead, they focused on flow and adaptation. Victoria learned to move in ways that were unpredictable, changing direction without warning, using her body weight in unexpected ways. Colonel Hughes would be there in the chamber with her, not attacking but observing. He would watch her movements and occasionally make adjustments to her posture or technique. Sometimes he would ask her questions, not practical questions about where to step or how to defend herself, but philosophical questions. Why did she think the Vareth fought the way they did? What would happen if she did something that made no logical sense? How would an opponent react if she deliberately threw herself off balance? The afternoons were dedicated to studying the Vareth. Victoria watched recorded footage of Varath warriors in combat. She studied their patterns. She noticed that every move seemed calculated, every attack timed precisely. The Vareth fought like they were following a script. They evaluated their opponent, determined the optimal attack strategy, and executed it. When something unexpected happened, they paused slightly while their bioneural implants recalculated. That pause was everything. It was the weakness hiding inside their strength. Lieutenant Cooper worked with Victoria on psychological tactics. He taught her how to make an opponent doubt themselves, how to appear weak when she was actually strong, how to make an enemy adjust their strategy to her advantage. Cooper explained that warfare was not only about physical strength. It was also about understanding how your opponent thought and using that understanding against them. 3 months passed. Victoria's body changed. She became leaner, more flexible, more adaptable. Her mind changed too. She began to see problems differently. Where she had once looked for the most direct solution, she now considered the most unexpected one. Dr. Webb monitored her brain activity carefully. He noticed that her neural pathways were changing. The parts of her brain responsible for creative thinking and rapid problem-solving were becoming more active and more efficient. The parts responsible for following rigid patterns were becoming less dominant. She was becoming more human in the most essential way. She was learning to embrace the chaos that all humans contained within themselves. One evening, after training had finished for the day, Victoria sat with Colonel Hughes in the observation room overlooking the training chamber. They watched the sun set through the reinforced viewport. Hughes told her something that Victoria would not forget. He said that throughout human history, humans had faced opponents who were bigger, stronger, and better equipped. Yet humans had survived. They had thrived. They had built civilizations that spanned continents and eventually reached beyond their own world. Not because they were physically superior, but because they could think in ways their enemies could not. They could adapt to situations that should have been impossible. They could find victory in defeat. This quality was not learned through training alone. It was something that lived inside humanity itself. Victoria asked Hughes if he thought she could actually win. He did not say yes immediately. Instead, he turned to look at her directly. He told her that winning was not the point. The point was to prove that humanity could not be measured by the simple standards the Vareth used. The point was to prove that beneath the surface of every human lay infinite possibilities. As the weeks moved toward the final day of preparation, Victoria felt both fear and certainty growing inside her. She had never faced a challenge like this before, but she had also never faced a challenge where the normal rules did not apply. The Varath expected her to think like a warrior from their own worlds, creatures bred for combat over thousands of years. They would never expect her to fight like something entirely different. They would never expect her to embrace the unpredictable, creative chaos that defined human consciousness. The night before she was scheduled to leave the facility and head toward the Varath command vessel, Victoria stood alone in the training chamber. The lights were dimmed to half brightness. She moved slowly through the techniques that Priya had taught her, letting her body remember every movement. Each motion felt like a conversation between different parts of herself, each part agreeing to work together in a way that was completely their own. She understood now what she had come to this facility to learn. It was not a fighting technique. It was not a weapon or a strategy, though it could be all of those things. What she had learned was how to be more fully human, how to trust the parts of humanity that could not be measured on any Varath scale. When morning came, Victoria left the facility. The transport ship climbed upward through the atmosphere. Behind her, the desert faded into the distance. Ahead of her, the Vareth fleet waited. They believed she was outmatched. They believed she had no chance of success. They had no idea that was exactly the point. Victoria stood in the chamber designated for the challenge. It was a massive circular arena, easily 1,000 feet across, with walls that rose high above her head. The floor beneath her feet was smooth and dark, almost black, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She could feel the cool air moving across her skin. Somewhere above, she knew, the Vareth Council was watching through transparent barriers. The chamber itself had been designed by the Vareth to test strategic thinking and physical capability in equal measure. There were obstacles scattered randomly across the floor. Some were low walls that could be climbed over or moved around. Others were elevated platforms that required jumping. There were also areas where the floor seemed to shift and move slightly, designed to test balance and adaptability. Victoria wore the combat suit they had provided her. It was sleek and black, fitted closely to her body. The suit had monitoring equipment built into it that would track her vital signs and transmit them to the Vareth Council. She could feel the sensors against her skin, reading her heart rate, her body temperature, her muscle tension. Everything about her would be measured and recorded. She waited in the center of the arena. Her hands were open at her sides. Her breathing was steady. 3 months of training had prepared her physically, but it was her mind that she relied upon now. She had learned to quiet the parts of her brain that felt fear and amplify the parts that could see possibilities. A doorway on the opposite side of the arena opened. The figure that emerged was so impressive that Victoria had to consciously remind herself not to react with shock. This was Kael'vor, the Vareth champion. Kael'vor was nearly 8 feet tall. His body was covered in something that resembled skin but had a faint metallic sheen to it. His muscles were enormous, built for a body that probably weighed 3 times what Victoria weighed. His face was angular and sharp with no visible expression. Behind his left eye, she could see the faint glow of circuitry. That was the bioneural implant Colonel Hughes had warned her about. It was the source of Kael'vor's tactical calculations and combat enhancements. The champion did not acknowledge Victoria in any way. He simply walked to a position opposite her and waited. A voice filled the chamber. It was Council Speaker Zelax. She announced the beginning of the trial. The rules were simple. The challenge would continue until one combatant was unable to continue. Yielding was allowed. Death was not forbidden, though the Vareth preferred their champions to survive for future contests. Victoria and Kael'vor began to circle each other. The champion moved with fluid precision, each step calculated and controlled. Victoria moved more loosely, less predictably. She varied her pace and direction, never settling into a rhythm. Kael'vor attacked first. His strike was devastatingly fast and aimed directly at Victoria's torso. By any normal measure, the blow should have connected instantly. But Victoria did not move the way Kael'vor expected her to move. Instead of ducking straight backward or to the side, she twisted at an angle that seemed inefficient. She moved just far enough that Kael'vor's massive fist whistled past her. The champion adjusted instantly. His implant recalculated. His next strike came from a different angle, faster and more aggressive. Victoria slipped past this one as well, but barely. She could feel the wind from the movement. This close, she could see the indicators on the bioneural implant beginning to glow brighter. Kael'vor continued attacking. Strike after strike came at her with relentless precision. Victoria dodged most of them, though a few connected. She felt pain in her shoulder where one blow landed glancingly. Blood ran down her arm from a cut on her upper chest, but she did not slow down. Instead, she moved faster, making her movements even more chaotic. The champion's implant began to flash more rapidly. The Varath warrior was processing faster and faster, trying to predict Victoria's movements. But there was nothing to predict. Victoria was not following any pattern. She was simply moving in ways that made sense to her in each moment. After nearly 20 minutes of continuous combat, something changed. Kael'vor's movements became slightly jerky. There was a delay in his response that had not been there before. His bioneural implant was struggling. It was being asked to process information faster than it was designed to process it. Victoria recognized the moment of weakness. Instead of attacking directly, she did something unexpected. She deliberately moved into a position that seemed vulnerable. She made herself look like an easy target. Kael'vor's implant seized the opportunity. The champion launched his most powerful strike yet. calculated to end the match immediately. Victoria waited until the last possible moment, then moved in a way that was physically dangerous. She allowed the blow to clip her, taking damage she did not need to take, but in doing so she disrupted the champion's momentum entirely. Kael'vor stumbled forward. His massive body, designed for power and precision, became a liability when those qualities were upset. Victoria used her smaller frame to slip beneath his guard. She used leverage and positioning to bring the champion down. His enormous body crashed to the floor. For a moment, there was complete silence in the chamber. The Vareth had never seen anything like this before. Victoria stood above Kael'vor, breathing heavily, blood dripping from several wounds. The champion was trying to rise, but his bioneural implant was flickering with errors. It seemed to be crashing and restarting repeatedly. Council Speaker Zelax's voice filled the arena. She announced that the first trial was complete. Victoria Hayes had defeated the Vareth, champion through methods that could not be analyzed by their standard combat evaluation systems. Virath technicians rushed into the arena and led Kael'vor away for repairs and recovery. Victoria was escorted to a medical chamber where her wounds were treated. The medical robots worked quickly and efficiently, sealing the cuts and reducing the swelling. But before Victoria had time to rest, the voice came again. The Vareth Council had decided that the first trial was a fortunate circumstance, a lucky outcome, brought about by random chance rather than genuine superiority. Victoria would face a second trial. This time she would face 3 champions instead of 1. Victoria felt exhaustion wash over her, but she did not allow it to show on her face. She had known this might happen. The Varath would not accept a single victory as proof. They would need more evidence. She would need to defeat not just one opponent, but multiple opponents, each one understanding how she had defeated the one before. She returned to the arena. 3 Varath champions now stood opposite her. They were not identical to Kael'vor, but they were similar. Similar size, similar strength, similar bioneural implants. Victoria rolled her shoulders and moved to the center of the arena. Her body was sore. Her mind was tired, but something inside her had awakened during that first battle. She had proven that she could stand against a Vareth champion. Now she had to prove that was not luck. She raised her hands in the combat position that Priya had taught her. The 3 champions began to advance. Victoria took a breath and moved forward to meet them. She was outmatched by every conventional measure, but then again, she had never been very good at following conventional measurements. Victoria faced the 3 champions simultaneously. The arena floor seemed smaller now, crowded with massive bodies moving in coordinated patterns. The Vareth had learned from watching her defeat Kael'vor. These 3 did not fight independently. They moved together, trying to trap her in a corner or force her into a position where escape was impossible. She moved through the arena like water flowing around stones. She did not try to defeat all 3 at once. Instead, she focused on one, then shifted her attention to another, then back to the first. She would engage one champion briefly, then slip away before the others could close in. She would use the arena obstacles to her advantage, climbing over walls when she needed space, ducking under elevated platforms when the champions were too close. One of the 3 champions was slightly faster than the others. Victoria noticed this quickly. She began deliberately positioning herself so that this champion would have to defend against the other 2, while also trying to catch her. She made herself an unrewarding target for the fastest one, forcing that champion to divide his attention. His bioneural implant began to show stress indicators similar to what had happened to Kael'vor. After 40 minutes of intense combat, Victoria managed to create a moment where she could isolate each champion briefly. She used that moment to strike at the fastest one with precision, hitting vulnerable points that would not permanently damage him, but would disable him enough to fall. Then she turned her attention to the remaining 2. The second champion she defeated through a different method. She deliberately absorbed several of his strikes, using the impact to reposition herself. She moved closer than seemed safe, entered his guard and used leverage to throw him off balance. His massive body was a disadvantage when he was on the ground, and she could keep him there. The third champion lasted the longest. This one seemed to understand what she was doing. Instead of trying to trap her, he attempted to push her toward exhaustion. He moved in patterns designed to force her to move constantly, to tire her out, to make her eventually slow down enough for a decisive blow. But Victoria had trained for this. She had learned to read her own body's signals. When she felt fatigue beginning to affect her movements, she changed her strategy entirely. Instead of moving constantly, she became still. She planted herself in the center of the arena and made the champion come to her. She seemed vulnerable, but it was a carefully calculated vulnerability. When the champion attacked, she moved minimally, using his own force against him. She made each of his movements work against him. Finally, the third champion fell. Victoria collapsed to her knees in the center of the arena, breathing so hard that she thought her lungs might burst. Blood covered much of her body. Her muscles screamed with pain. But she was still conscious. She was still alive. The Vareth Council was silent for an unusually long time. When Council Speaker Zalax spoke again, her voice carried something that sounded almost like doubt. She announced that Victoria had now defeated 4 Vareth champions. The Council wished to understand the source of her victories. They demanded that Victoria submit to a comprehensive physical examination. They would scan her body for any technological enhancements or hidden genetic modifications. Victoria agreed. She was escorted to a medical chamber more advanced than anything on Earth. The scanning technology was extraordinary. It could see inside her body at a cellular level. It could analyze her blood chemistry, her neural patterns, her muscular structure. For hours, the Varath examined her. When the examination was complete, they found nothing. Victoria was not augmented with technology. Her genetic structure was completely normal for a human. There were no hidden advantages. She was exactly what she appeared to be. A human woman, physically inferior to the Vareth in every measurable way. This confused the Vareth greatly. Their logic could not reconcile her victories with her physical inferiority. They hypothesized that perhaps they did not understand something fundamental about human biology. Perhaps there was a human capacity they had not yet discovered. They requested that Victoria undergo psychological testing. They wanted to understand how her mind worked. They used technology that could measure her brain activity and map her neural pathways. They asked her questions and observed how her thoughts moved through her consciousness. Colonel Hughes transmitted messages back to Earth explaining what was happening. He told the world leaders that the Vareth were beginning to understand the truth. Victoria's victories were not coming from hidden technology or hidden genetic advantages. They were coming from something that could not be hidden because it was not an enhancement. It was simply humanity itself. It was the human capacity to think unpredictably, to adapt to chaos, to find solutions that did not fit into predetermined categories. After 3 days of rest and medical care, Victoria was called back to the arena for a 5th trial. This time she faced 4 champions, each one more experienced than the last. They coordinated their attacks even more carefully than the 3 had done. They seemed to have studied recordings of all her previous fights and understood her patterns better. But here was the thing about patterns. Once a human recognized that someone was trying to predict their patterns, they simply created new patterns. Victoria seemed to remember something she had not used before in each fight. She would move in a way that suggested she was about to do one thing, then do something completely different. She would sacrifice advantages she had worked hard to create in order to disrupt her opponent's expectations. She won again. Then she fought 5 champions. Then 6. With each successive trial, the Vareth brought opponents that were more powerful, more heavily augmented, more experienced in combat. Victoria lost pieces of herself in each fight. She lost a tooth. A finger was broken badly enough that it had to be set. Her ribs were cracked. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, but she continued to win. Not because she was stronger or faster. She won because her mind worked differently. She won because humans had evolved to adapt to unexpected situations. She won because she could embrace chaos while her opponents could only process it as a problem to be solved mathematically. By the time Victoria had faced and defeated 17 champions, the Vareth began to change how they spoke about her. They no longer called her an outmatched human female. They began referring to her as the adaptive opponent and the unpredictable warrior. More importantly, they began to speak amongst themselves about what this meant. The Vareth had assumed that strength and logic could defeat any opponent, but they had never encountered an opponent who did not fight with strength or pure logic. They had never faced someone who moved through conflict the way Victoria moved through the arena. Council Speaker Zelax called for a diplomatic meeting between Victoria and the Vareth leadership. She appeared on a screen in the medical chamber, where Victoria was recovering from her latest battle. Zelax told Victoria that the Verith Council had reached a conclusion. They still believed humans were developing as a species. They still believed humans lacked the advanced capability of Verith civilization in most areas. But there was one area where humans were decidedly superior, the area of tactical flexibility and adaptive thinking. The Verith had discovered something about their own nature during these trials. Their strength came from their logic and their predictability. But that same quality was also their weakness. In a universe full of unexpected variables, the ability to adapt and embrace unpredictability was perhaps more valuable than any amount of superior technology. Therefore, Zelax announced, the Verith would withdraw their integration demands. Earth would be granted protected status within the Galactic Union. The Verath would leave the solar system within 1 year and would not return without explicit invitation from Earth's leadership. Victoria had won. Not through superior strength or technology. She had won through being more fully human than the Verith could possibly understand. Victoria stood in the observation chamber of the Verith command vessel, looking down at Earth. The blue planet hung in the darkness of space, beautiful and fragile and completely vulnerable to the weapons hanging above it. But those weapons would not fire. The crisis had passed. It had been 2 weeks since Council Speaker Zelax officially announced the withdrawal. The Verith fleet had begun its movement away from Earth's orbit. The ships that had seemed so threatening now appeared to be leaving. The people of Earth, who had spent weeks living in fear, began to believe that they might actually survive. Victoria's body was covered with bandages and healing injuries. The medical staff on the Verith ship had provided the best treatment available in the galaxy, but recovery took time. She had broken bones, torn muscles, and countless wounds that would leave scars. She looked like someone who had fought 17 warriors and lived to tell about it, but her spirit felt lighter than it had in months. Colonel Nathan Hughes arrived on a transport ship from Earth. He embraced Victoria carefully, mindful of her injuries. Hughes told her that the world was calling her a hero. Governments were declaring her achievements as the greatest military victory in human history. Some people were suggesting that statues be built in her honor. Others wanted her to run for leadership positions. Everyone wanted to know how she had done it. Victoria smiled weakly. She told Hughes that she had not done anything extraordinary. She had simply been human. She had adapted. She had refused to fight the way the Verith expected her to fight. She had embraced the qualities that made humans different from the Verath rather than trying to match them at their own strengths. Dr. Marcus Webb sent a detailed message from Earth. Webb had been analyzing all the recorded data from Victoria's fights. He had studied her neural patterns during combat and compared them to the Verith champions. His conclusions were fascinating. Victoria's brain operated differently during combat than the Verith implants did. While the alien computers calculated optimal solutions based on existing data, Victoria's brain created new solutions in real time. She was literally thinking in ways that had never been calculated before. Webb wrote that this suggested a fundamental difference in how human brains were wired compared to Verath brains. Humans had evolved to survive in a world full of unpredictability. Their brains had developed to handle situations that had no precedent, no existing solution. The Verath, on the other hand, had evolved to perfect existing systems and maintain them across vast civilizations. They were excellent at what they did, but they had not needed to constantly adapt to the unknown. Now, Webb concluded, the Verath knew that such adaptation existed. They knew that humans possessed it. This knowledge would change everything. Over the following weeks, representatives from other alien civilizations began arriving at Earth. The news had spread throughout the galactic community. A single human female had defeated 17 Verith champions through adaptability and unconventional thinking. This was remarkable. This was unprecedented. Species across the galaxy wanted to study how humans thought. Some of these visitors were friendly. Others seemed to view humans as potential threats. A few appeared to be simply curious about this new capability they had never encountered before. Universities began reaching out to Earth, requesting permission to send researchers. Several alien governments expressed interest in establishing cultural exchange programs with humanity. The United Nations held a gathering to plan Earth's response to this sudden attention. The world leaders who had wanted to surrender to the Verith now spoke with pride about humanity's achievements. Victoria attended the meeting. though she was not officially part of the government. They asked her opinion about how to proceed. Victoria told them that Earth should use this moment carefully. The attention would not last forever. Eventually, the galaxy would become accustomed to human adaptability. But for now, humanity should establish itself as a people who valued creativity, flexibility, and innovative thinking. They should build relationships with other species based on these qualities. They should show the galaxy what humans could offer beyond military capability. Months passed. Victoria recovered from her injuries, though some of the damage was permanent. Her left hand would never have full strength again. Her left eye did not see as well as before. But these were small prices to pay for saving her entire species. She declined all offers to run for political office. Instead, she began planning something different. Working with a team of educators, military strategists, and philosophers, Victoria designed the Institute for Adaptive Strategy. The institute would be located on Earth, and it would be open to students from any species in the galaxy who wanted to learn how to think adaptively. The institute taught courses in unconventional problem-solving, tactical flexibility, and creative thinking under pressure. But more importantly, it taught something that could not really be taught. It taught people how to question their assumptions. It taught them to embrace uncertainty rather than fear it. It taught them that sometimes the best solution to a problem was one that had never been tried before. Years passed. Victoria continued her work with the Institute, though she worked mostly behind the scenes. She did not write books or give speeches about her experiences.
She did not seek attention or fame.
Instead, she focused on helping the next generation of thinkers learn to adapt the way she had adapted. The Verath, in the meantime, began to face serious challenges. The very predictability that had made them successful for thousands of years became a liability in a rapidly changing galactic environment. New conflicts arose that their traditional tactics could not handle. They attempted to hire human consultants to help them develop new strategies, but they discovered that human adaptability could not be outsourced or imported. It had to be developed internally, learned through experience and struggle. Eventually, the Verath collective began to fracture. Different factions developed different approaches to problems. Some tried to embrace adaptability, but they could not do it in the same way humans could. Others refused to change, insisting that the old ways were still the best ways. These divisions grew stronger over time. Within 15 years, the Verath collective had dissolved entirely. The ancient civilization that had ruled 3,000 worlds had fallen, not to military force but to the simple realization that their way of thinking no longer worked. Other species in the galaxy took notice. Many of them sent representatives to Earth to study at Victoria's Institute. The institute grew and eventually expanded to multiple campuses on different worlds. Students from 100 different species learned together to think in new ways, to question their assumptions, to embrace the kind of creative chaos that humans understood so naturally. Victoria became an old woman eventually. Her hair turned white, her face wrinkled, her body grew frail, but her mind remained sharp. She continued to teach until the very end of her life, always insisting that she was not special, that any human could have done what she had done if they had been brave enough to try. On the day Victoria died, representatives from dozens of alien species came to her memorial service. They spoke about how she had changed their understanding of what was possible. They spoke about how she had shown the galaxy that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was simply the ability to think in a way that had never been thought before. Earth, which had once been marked for extinction, had become known as the birthplace of adaptive thinking. Humans, who had once been considered inferior and outmatched, were now recognized as possessing a unique and invaluable quality. Victoria Hayes had proven that being outmatched did not mean being defeated. It had simply meant that the match itself needed to be played by different rules. And humans, after all, had always been very good at changing the rules when the old ones no longer served them. The age of human potential had begun. 5 years had passed since Victoria Hayes established the Institute for Adaptive Strategy. The Institute had grown into a thriving center of learning, with students from 50 different alien species walking its corridors every day. The campus was beautiful, designed with architecture that honored both human and alien aesthetics. Buildings of glass and steel stood alongside organic structures that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Victoria was 62 years old now. She moved more slowly than she used to, and pain was always present somewhere in her body from old injuries, but her mind remained sharp, and her presence at the Institute continued to inspire those who studied there. One morning, Victoria received an unexpected visitor. The visitor was a Verath, the first one she had seen since the galactic community had begun to fracture. His name was Calvor. The name struck Victoria like a physical blow. This was the champion she had defeated in her very first trial in the arena. Calvor looked different now. His bio-neural implant was gone, removed and replaced with biological neural enhancements that looked primitive by Verath standards. He moved differently, too, less like a machine and more like a living creature. He had aged. There were cracks and scars across his metallic skin that had not been there before. Victoria invited him into her office. It was a simple room with large windows that looked out over the Institute grounds. Students of various species moved between buildings, discussing ideas and working on projects together. Calvor sat in the chair across from Victoria's desk. He seemed uncertain, which was strange to see in a warrior who had once seemed absolutely confident. He told Victoria that much had changed in the Verath civilization since their last encounter. The removal of the bio-neural implants had been controversial. Some Verath warriors had refused to let the implants be taken away, arguing that they were essential to Verath identity and strength. But many others had begun to understand what Victoria had shown them. The implants, while powerful, limited what they could think and how they could adapt. So they had chosen to remove them and try to develop biological thinking that was more flexible and creative. It was painful. It was difficult. Many Verath struggled with the transition from pure logic to something more nuanced. The Verath civilization had fractured because not everyone agreed with this change. Some factions maintained the old ways, others attempted to embrace the new approach. Wars had broken out between different Verath groups. The ancient civilization that had dominated the galaxy for thousands of years was tearing itself apart from the inside. Victoria asked Calvor why he had come to Earth. The champion said he had come to ask for help. The internal conflicts within Verath civilization had grown so severe that peaceful resolution seemed impossible. Different factions were developing weapons more destructive than ever before. If the fighting continued, the Verath might not just fracture into smaller groups, they might destroy themselves completely. Calvor explained that he had been assigned to request assistance from the Institute for Adaptive Strategy. The moderate Verath factions believed that humans might be able to help them find solutions to their internal conflicts that did not involve violence and destruction. Victoria listened carefully. She understood what Calvor was asking, but she also understood what it meant. The Verath had once declared humans inferior and threatened them with extinction. Now those same Verath were asking humans for help saving their civilization. Victoria told Calvor that the Institute could not simply solve the Verath problems for them. Adaptation and creative thinking had to be developed from within. But the Institute could send educators and facilitators who could help the Verath learn to think in new ways. Whether the Verath chose to learn was up to them. Calvor agreed to this proposal. Before he left Victoria's office, he said something that surprised her. He told her that during their battle in the arena, he had been afraid, not of her physical threat, but of the uncertainty she represented. His bio-neural implant had kept him safe from uncertainty by always providing logical solutions. But Victoria had shown him that sometimes the most important solutions came from embracing uncertainty rather than running from it. He said that defeating him had been an act of mercy, though she had not known it. By showing him that his way of thinking had limits, she had given him the opportunity to become something more than what he was. After Calvor left, Victoria sat alone in her office for a long time. She thought about the arc of events that had brought them to this moment. She had fought to save humanity from extinction. In doing so, she had inadvertently started a chain reaction that transformed the entire galactic community. Over the next several months, the Institute for Adaptive Strategy sent teams of educators to various Verath worlds. The educators were not there to tell the Verath what to do. Instead, they taught methods of thinking and problem-solving that encouraged creative approaches to conflict resolution. Some Verath refused the instruction. They saw it as weakness and betrayal of their heritage. But others engaged seriously with the learning. These Verath began to develop new approaches to their internal conflicts. Instead of trying to defeat one faction entirely, They began to look for solutions that could satisfy multiple perspectives. Gradually, the internal Varath conflicts began to decrease. Not entirely. Some wars continued, but the intensity diminished. More Varath began to see the value in diversity of thought rather than in forced unity of logic. One Varath faction even established their own academy based on principles derived from Victoria's Institute. They called it the Center for Varath Renewal. It became a place where Varath could learn to think beyond the limitations of their old systems. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the success of the Institute's intervention with the Varath led to requests from other species. The Krelni, a species known for their rigid hierarchical structure, asked for help addressing internal unrest. The Soren Collective, whose members were biologically connected to one another in a kind of shared consciousness, wanted to learn how to maintain individual creativity while preserving their collective identity. Each species brought different challenges. Each species had to learn to adapt in ways that made sense for their particular biology and culture. But the common thread was always the same. By learning to embrace flexibility and creative thinking, species could solve problems that had seemed unsolvable under their old systems. Victoria began to understand that what she had started was not really about human superiority. It was about something much deeper. It was about the fact that there were many different ways to be intelligent, many different ways to solve problems, many different ways to think. When species that had been isolated from each other came together and shared these different ways of thinking, everyone became stronger. Years continued to pass. Victoria grew older. She trained younger educators to take her place at the Institute. She wrote down some of her thoughts and experiences, not as a biography but as teaching materials that other educators could use. The galaxy continued to change. The rigid hierarchies that had dominated for so long began to soften. Species that had once seen themselves as superior or inferior to others began to see themselves as simply different. They began to learn from each other, and at the center of it all, Victoria's Institute continued its work. It was no longer just about teaching humans what made them special. It was about helping all species discover what made them special, and then learning how those special qualities could be shared with others. Victoria often stood on the observation deck of the Institute, looking out at the students and educators working together. They came from dozens of different worlds, spoke dozens of different languages, thought in dozens of different ways, but they all shared a commitment to adaptation, creativity, and the belief that there was always more to learn. The woman who had once been declared outmatched had become the teacher who showed the galaxy how to truly grow. And that, Victoria reflected, was a far greater victory than any single battle could ever have been.